Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and we're here for my Spring Split 2023 LCS Playoff Primer video. Super excited to get this one out. I released my LCK version of this video yesterday. If you didn't check that one out, go check it out. The link to that's going to be up in the iCard right now. But in this video, we're going to be going over a ton of stuff. Not only am I going to be giving you guys a roundup of all of the 6 teams in the playoffs, the first round matchups, we're going to be covering advantages, disadvantages, going over where I think some teams might have the, strong side of the map, where some teams might be a little bit weaker compared to their opponents, and then also giving a full mock bracket of the playoffs. And then, of course, also in this video is going to be my 2023 Spring Split award predictions. That means MVP, Rookie of the Split, and all 3 All-Pro teams, my personal picks. Again, not what I think that the LCS will actually pick, because they can be a little bit finicky with their criteria. At least, some of the voters can be a little bit finicky with their criteria, but this is what I would personally vote for if I had the chance. Of course, if you guys are excited for this video, let me know down in the comments section below. These videos are always some of the most controversial that I do all year long. I can say that about a lot of my content that isn't the weekly reviews. When you get to, like, the really strong opinions, the player rankings, the award picks, that's when people really start coming out of the woodwork to question my validity. And so if you do enjoy this video, hit that like button. It really will mean a lot to me. Obviously, I don't ask for that at the beginning of videos very often on this channel, but with videos like this, it really would mean a lot if you guys hit that like button. If you are enjoying it, of course. Don't just hit it to hit it. If you enjoyed this video, though, hit it. Anyways, let's go ahead and jump into it. I don't want to waste too much of you guys' time. We've got a lot of fun stuff to cover in this one, starting off with our regular season awards. Now, I do want to do a little bit of a disclaimer. I'm going to kind of talk about my process here. This is something I failed to do in the LCK video. I probably should have gone a little bit more in depth as to how I select a lot of these things. To me, and this is just my personal preference, again, first of all, a lot of this is just my opinion. All of it, in fact, is just my opinion. You are allowed to disagree with it. You are allowed to have someone else, especially for MVP. There are so many good candidates in the LCS this year. Quite frankly, you want to pick any of them? Go ahead. There really isn't a wrong answer, but I would say a lot of my criteria personally is how much did you change the fortunes of your team this split. I actually don't take, like, mechanical skill and mechanical, like, dominance into account as much as I take into account, like, how many wins did you add to your team, in my opinion. That is what MVP, that is what All-Pro is for. And so you might see some players that both me and a lot of other people would unanimously agree on to be better than maybe some of the players that are on this list not be on it. But I'll be making the argument for why I think the players that are on my list today were the most impactful towards their team's success. Again, like, I do a whole player ranking series at the beginning of each split, at the beginning of each major tournament. If you guys are ready and waiting to see what players I think are more mechanically dominant than others, you can check out my preseason power rankings. Those have held up pretty well, but this list is mostly going to be the players that I think influenced their team's success in a positive way more so than others. And so that's going to be my criteria, but with that out of the way, I've already wasted 3 minutes. Let's go ahead and jump into the biggest award that you can give out in spring of 2023, the MVP. Again, like I said, there are a lot of good choices for this, mostly because no one was consistently the single best player in the LCS throughout the entire split. A lot of players kind of took turns being the best player, but for me, and this is going to be controversial, I landed on Prince. Prince is going to be my Spring Split MVP, and I know people aren't going to really like to hear that, but I really like how Prince played, and, I'll kind of get to this. I think FlyQuest is a significantly worse team without Prince in the bot lane. I think that is really the big deciding factor for me. My honorable mentions, as you can see, are my top 3. So Prince was number 1, I had Fudge at 2, I had Berserker at 3, but those 3 are separated by inches, certainly not miles, and that's where I want to kind of talk about this. Prince, first of all, was awesome. I don't want it to seem like, I have to defend my pick for Prince. A lot of people are going to pick Prince as their MVP. I'm not exactly sure he's going to get it. I think it'll probably be Berserker if I had to take a guess as to what the LCS voters will do. But that shouldn't take away from what Prince was able to accomplish in his first split here in North America. not only did he completely take over the league in the first couple of weeks, but he carried FlyQuest to a really dominant record throughout the entire split. I know they didn't necessarily, have the best final weeks of the season, but this team was ridiculously far ahead of everyone else for most of the year. I mean, even when you're looking at, the final 2 weeks of the season, going into the final week of the year, we had started questioning things, but going into the second to the last week of the year, FlyQuest was still the undisputed #1 team in a lot of people's eyes. They started to falter towards the back half, yes, but to have most of the split be kind of narratively dominated by you and what your team was able to accomplish, that is certainly worthwhile, even when I'm just talking about gameplay. Like, their gameplay dominated the narrative because it deserved to. They were the best team for a while, and Prince was the source of that dominance. His laning stats have definitely faltered a bit, but I do think that when you watch those games, you can start to realize why. FlyQuest in particular really started to get targeted a lot in the bottom lane. Now, a lot of people are going to bring up the support change, talking about how, that may have affected bot lane. It certainly didn't affect Prince's mechanical skill. He was phenomenal in terms of positioning towards the back half of the year. And really, when he got the opportunity to carry, when the team gave him the opportunity to carry, he almost always did it at a super high level, which is impressive. And obviously, you can say the same thing about players like Fudge and Berserker. This isn't meant to kind of put them down. I just want to prop all three of them up if I absolutely can. It is really cool to see the amount of talent that we have in North America right now, Prince included. Now, I know a lot of people are going to point out the tiebreaker game, and this is where I kind of want to get into this. I know on broadcast, they said that tiebreaker games count towards MVP voting and All-Pro voting. I'm not going to do that because I think that that's dumb, if I'm being entirely honest. First of all, the stat trackers that everyone uses when I go to look at, damage per minute and damage percentage and goal difference of 15, stats that do kind of influence some of my decisions, not all the way, but do play a part in influencing some of my decisions, those aren't going to take any tiebreaker games into account. They're only going to take the first 18, and also that puts a big unfair advantage towards some of the teams that maybe played multiple tiebreakers, like 100 Thieves, right? Double Lift gained what, like 20 kills in the tiebreaker games? That's surely going to skyrocket him above some of these other players in terms of stats, but I thought it only fair to take the exact amount of games that everyone played, 18. You got 18 chances to prove your worth. Everybody got the same amount, and for me, in those 18 games, Prince was the most valuable player to his team. I think you could argue that, Fudge or Berserker, who were both phenomenal on the best team in the league, definitely were, mechanically right up there with Prince, but when you're talking about value, when you're talking about adding wins to your team, for me, that was Prince on FlyQuest this year. And then moving on to my Rookie of the Split discussion. Now, I know that in the LCS, they do Rookie of the Year rather than Rookie of the Split, but I thought it'd be nice and fun to go over maybe some of the rookies that were doing really well in the LCS this split. Of course, there were a lot of really young rookies coming in this season with a lot of expectations, and so this award, for the first time in quite a few years, was actually a award that was fought over by a lot of pretty decent talent in the LCS, but in the end, my Spring 2023 Rookie of the Split is going to go to Eminus on Cloud9. Now, a lot of people are going to throw Eminus out basically immediately because of games played. He only came in the second half of the split. I believe he played 9 or 10 games, something like that. And some people might throw him out immediately because of that. If you don't play a full split, etc., you don't deserve to be in the All-Pro voting. And I can understand that. If that's your mentality, then great. There are a lot of good candidates, but when I'm looking at Rookie of the Split, I'm looking at the rookie in the LCS that made the biggest impact for their team, and to me, that was Eminus. He was clearly the most impactful rookie, although I think that Jan and Busio were definitely two that definitely deserved honorable mentions, as you can see down there, but Eminus's impact immediately into Cloud9 reinvigorated this team more so than any other player in the entire league joining their squad, and that is really the big difference maker to me, is the circumstance surrounding Eminus joining. They immediately became this like 3, 4, 5-headed monster on Cloud9 when Eminus was there, because his ability to take over the game in the mid lane that Diplex just wasn't offering this team was so different to really what this team was offering before that. A lot of it was on Blabber, and a lot of it was on Fudge in the top lane in particular to be able to win early. Berserker was going to be fine. He really didn't have to change his playstyle all that much, but Blabber and Fudge definitely kind of acquiesced a bit to let Eminus in. I was worried about the fit. I was worried about how some aggressive players on the top side of the map would be able to handle a mid laner who wanted more resources. Well, all of those fears have been quelled at this point for me. He has fit into this team seamlessly. Him and Blabber seem to have some fantastic chemistry, and honestly, his added mechanical prowess just creates this very difficult decision for every team that goes up against Cloud9. You have to sacrifice a lane against this team, and it really isn't easy to choose which one now that Eminus can dominate the 1v1 as well as he can. A lot of his picks actually don't show up in his most played. You're seeing LeBlanc, Jace, Syndra. You know, those are good picks for him, right? But when I see Eminus, I think of things like Vex, right? Like things, Akali, things that he can actively take over the game on. Those might be some sneaky picks for playoffs for things that this team could potentially bring out. But generally speaking, Eminus fit onto Cloud9 incredibly well, and it was a pretty easy choice as long as he was eligible, which I'm going to consider him eligible. He played more than half of games this split, which means, to me, I considered him eligible. He was the most impactful rookie to his team in the entire league. The other honorable mentions for me: Yawn on Team Liquid, Busio on 100 Thieves. I think both of them were really solid. Yawn's going to get a bad rap because his team was bad, but I would argue bot lane was the strength of that team almost the entirety of the year. Pioshik started to get his shit together towards the back half of the year, but he was awful for the first half. And then Summit had some really great laning phases and some atrocious late games, and it was really up to Yawn and Core to be able to stabilize both in the early and late game. I think Yawn didn't get nearly enough credit for how well he played this year. He's going to get an honorable mention there. And then Busio, another player that I think had a pretty poor start to the year, but man, did he pick it up. When 100 Thieves went on their winning streak towards the back half and he was getting recon almost every single game, Busio looked like a superstar in that support position. He is coming in third for me because, again, that first half of the year really wasn't all that impressive for me personally, but he is turning into someone that you can truly count on in that support position, someone you do have to game plan against and actually fear on that 100 Thieves lineup. And so those three were definitely the top candidates, but for me, the difference between Eminus and them is pretty large, especially when you look at the impact. If Eminus can keep this up, if he can continue to be an absolute monster, maybe not what he was in the final week of the season, more so what he was before that, if he can do that, he is going to be a fantastic mid laner for Cloud9 for many years to come. But now that we've done our major awards for the split, the MVP, the Rookie of the Split, it is time to move on to my All-Pro selections. And if you guys thought I was going to get hate for MVP, and probably not for Rookie of the Split, in fact, most people are probably on my side for Rookie of the Split, this is where it really starts. I think this is probably the only kind of comment that I will get on this video, so again, if you guys enjoy it, let me know down in the comments section below. It really does, I really appreciate it. It really does mean a lot to me, but there is something controversial on every single one of these All-Pro team lists. And so, I'm excited to share them with you guys, but I'll definitely be going in depth as to why I made the decisions that I made. But starting off with my first team All-Pro up on the screen right now, and you can already see why I think some people are going to consider it controversial. But let's go ahead and go over who I have in my All-Pro first team. In the top lane, I have Fudge from Cloud9. In the jungle, I have Spica from FlyQuest. In the mid lane, I have Vikla from FlyQuest. In the bot lane, the MVP, Prince from FlyQuest. And in support, Huhi from Golden Guardians. Kind of a shocking inclusion there. I think a lot of these might be surprising to a few people. Some might say that some of these are crazy picks, but I'll go ahead and give my reasoning for why I think I ended up going with these. Top lane, no controversy here. This was a no-brainer pick. Fudge was far and away the best top laner in the entire league, and it wasn't particularly close. Fudge was arguably the best player on Cloud9 this split, and I think that him being as good as he was in a role that a lot of people just aren't able to kind of separate themselves in right now really shows just how good he is. Early on in the season, you were talking about Prince being MVP, but Fudge was right in that conversation. And to me, they both finished the split as the two top people for MVP this year. Fudge was fantastic. To see a top laner get as many resources and do as much as he did with them, it's incredibly impressive. Obviously, we know he can play strong side, but he honestly upped his game from where he was last year. He was pretty good in playoffs, someone that I would consider a top 2, top 3 top laner in the region. This year, it is a no contest top 1 coming out from Fudge. Great split from him, and really he just improved on absolutely everything in his game. This was a no-brainer. Jungle, I do think I might get some pushback on. Maybe not a ton, though. Spica was really good this split, and I think a lot of people are catching up to that. Spica was really consistent, I think, for FlyQuest, where I think both him and the player that I have on second team, you can probably guess who it is, they were both fantastic and both probably first-team caliber players in their wins. I thought especially in some of their losses, Spica just wasn't nearly as big of a standout, I would say, in those. Not that he didn't have bad games here or there. I don't think anybody was, like, unflappable in the LCS this split. But Spica, I think, generally speaking, was very consistent over the course of the year. I really like how he meshed with a lot of the rest of the team. And honestly, considering the bounce back that he had, you know, not that last year was bad. Again, I was very much on the fence last year of, like, TSM was really bad, and Spica is by far the best player on this team. He's trying his best to carry them, and they're just not carryable. But I think any doubts that anybody had about Spica really were squashed going into this year. He's meshed with the team really well, and he was really consistent. Vikla in the mid lane, there's been some back and forth discussion about Vikla. It very much feels like there is a large contingent on the internet that's like, Vikla's the most overrated import, he's not even really all that good, and then there's another contingent that's like, Vikla's carrying Prince. I think we fall somewhere in the middle, as I tend to do on a lot of these issues. Vikla's a very good player, and he's definitely been a positive for FlyQuest, but generally speaking, mid lane was an incredibly weak position in the LCS this split. Not to say it hasn't been in the past. I think historically speaking, ever since Bjergsen and Jensen kind of stopped being the premier mid laners in the region, we haven't really had, like, the guy, you know what I mean? And Vikla did his best to kind of take that role. Even then, he still had some poor performances. I definitely think some of the games in the middle of the season, when they were going on a little bit of an up and down streak, weren't exactly perfect, but for the most part, there was a reason this team only lost one game up until the final 2 weeks of the year. Vikla was hyper consistent in the mid lane, willing to give up resources for his team, and he worked incredibly well with everybody else. I think he had the biggest impact on winning of any of the mid laners in the region, although I can see why people maybe are a little bit lower on him. And then I already talked about Prince. I don't need to get into it again. He was my MVP pick. 3 members of FlyQuest is certainly going to draw a lot of discussion because I said that Prince was probably the most valuable player to his team, but I'll kind of talk about why, later when we get to the team discussion. I think Cloud9 is better as a unit than maybe they are individually, and again, that's not to say individually mechanically, but more so just like the performances they put out. For FlyQuest in particular, when you're talking about these 3 players, there were some games where Spica looked like the MVP, there were some games where Vikla looked like the MVP, there were some games where Prince looked like the MVP, and I just don't really understand why people are so quick to dismiss what FlyQuest was able to do for most of the year. To me, very easy choice to put 3 people from FlyQuest into the All-Pro first team. And then, who he at support? This is going to draw some question mark pings, I think, from a lot of people, but man, he was Golden Guardians for a lot of this split now, wasn't he? Again, Gory was really good. I think River had some good games. River had some really bad ones down the stretch as well, but I think Huki was easily the most consistent player on Golden Guardians. Support, another position that I think is rather weak in the LCS. It's funny, I just did my LCK All-Pro teams yesterday, and it's the exact opposite. Support and mid are absolutely stacked in that region. I think they are probably the 2 thinnest roles in terms of top-level talent in the LCS right now. Huki was really good, though. I think without Huki on Golden Guardians, this team struggles a lot more. I'm not saying that they're not a playoff team, but I do think it becomes a lot more dangerously close. Huki, in my opinion, added probably 2 or 3 wins to this team this year, and remember, they finished 500 in the final seed in the playoffs. That's a really good year for a player like Huki. I think all of the doubts that he had accrued over the course of the last year or so on 100 Thieves have been absolved. I think he had a really, really good split, not only in terms of mechanical skill, but also in terms of just the macro and what he brought to the team in terms of impacting the map. I think generally he was the best at that of any of the supports in the entire region. But I know I'm going to get some pushback for 3 FlyQuest members, only 1 Cloud9 member in the first team All-Pro. Trust me, the other Cloud9 members will be represented shortly. But moving on now from our first team to our second team. It doesn't get easier to go down from here. Still some interesting opinions, and it's going to be up on the screen right now. You can go ahead and see my second team. I would say this one is probably the easiest to explain, except for a couple of positions, but, 3 of them I think are pretty easily explainable. In the top lane, I've got Impact from FlyQuest. In the jungle, Blabber from Cloud9. In the mid lane, Maple from TSM. In the bot lane, Berserker from Cloud9. And in the support position, Core JJ from Team Liquid. A lot of really good players here, in my opinion. Some of them might stand out a little more than others. 2 players who actually aren't making the playoffs, making my second team All-Pro. I'll go ahead and discuss that in a bit, but let's start off with Impact in the top lane. Of course, going top to support, a little bit easier to do that for me. Impact in the top lane on FlyQuest was just really consistent this year. Again, I actually thought he had a pretty poor 2022, all things considered. He was pretty solid in spring, but I actually think he was really hit or miss in 2022 for Evil Geniuses. Had some really atrocious laning phases. I think you could make a real argument he was the worst laner in the LCS in 2022. He was at least in the conversation. He was still fantastic in the late game team fights and making macro plays around the map. That's why picks like Gangplank were so good for him, because it allowed him to stay safe in the early game, not really needing to exert a lot of pressure and then just kind of scale up. But when he was tasked with any sort of pressure up in the top lane, he really couldn't handle it last year, which makes it so much more relieving to see that all just go away on FlyQuest in 2023. He was really strong this year. He was a big power point in the top lane for that Fly team, especially towards the early part of the year. And when he needed to be weak side, he was still really good at weak side. Impact is always going to be good on that role. I think he actively made his team a lot better, and I think that FlyQuest team would have a lot more troubles without Impact in the top lane. And then moving on to jungle, another easy choice here. If Spica's going to be in the first team, Blabber's got to be in the second team. They are the two best junglers in the league, and it is not particularly close. If you want Blabber in the first team, go for it. Honestly, Blabber versus Spica was the one that I thought about by far the most. If Blabber was in the first team for anybody else, I would not be surprised, and it would not be, like, wrong or whatever, right? They are almost equal in my eyes. I think Spica was maybe a bit more consistent in their losses, and that's kind of why I went with him. But Blabber, you could absolutely make the case, enabled his teammates more so than Spica did. I really do think it's up to personal preference, up to personal interpretation, who you put ahead there. I think Blabber's a better player. I think Spica had a better year. That's kind of how I ended up here. But Blabber's really, really, really good, man. The way he meshed with Eminus when it came in, and those two became such a two-headed monster moving around the map. The way he played such a great supportive role early on in the year when it came to Fudge. He just does everything that you could want out of a jungler. I think at his peak, mechanically speaking, the dude is a top, 5, 10 jungler in the entire world. I've been saying that for years. I've been the Blabber praiser for so long. It's crazy to see that I'm getting a lot of hate for being a Blabber hater now, knowing my track record on this channel and knowing how many comments I've gotten in the past about, being a Blabber dick rider, if you will. But he's still the same Blabber I know and love. I think Spica had a great year. Blabber also had a great year. Both of them were incredibly good, and Blabber more than deserves his place on the All-Pro list. Again, if you want him at first, I totally get it. That's the kind of year that Blabber had. In the mid lane, though, this is going to definitely throw some people off. I have Maple from TSM. I think people just kind of forgot about Maple, if I'm being entirely honest. TSM, in general, didn't exactly have the most explosive end to the split, but let's remember, all the conversation going through the first, I would say, 4 or 5 weeks of the split, the first round robin, essentially. Maple was the best mid laner in the LCS, and I don't even think it was really all that close. Pretty much everybody was picking him for their first team All-Pro at that point in the season. You can see that in a lot of the broadcasters. You can see that in a lot of the tweets around the time. People were really high on Maple, and honestly, rightfully so. The dude was absolutely crushing it for a TSM team that was in the playoffs for most of the year. Yes, they weren't able to get it done down the stretch, but this team still way outperformed expectations, and I think Maple was a big part of that. This was easily his best split in North America, and honestly, he got lost in the shuffle when a lot of these other players started coming in. Eminus came in, Vikla started stepping it up. We'll get to another player on the third team that really started playing well, even a player that I missed out on this All-Pro team playing really well. Maple kind of got lost in the shuffle a bit, but he more than deserves his place on this list for being a big catalyst for TSM being genuinely a competitive team the entirety of this split. They were a lot of fun to watch, and Maple, in my opinion, was the biggest reason for that. In the bot lane, it's Berserker. Berserker is a top 3 player in the league, maybe top 2 player in the league, but I can only fit one bot laner in first team, and I gave Prince MVP, so he gets it. Berserker is a first team kind of player, but again, bot lane's just one of those positions, especially this year in the LCS where, I had to leave some people off because there were just way too many good ones. Berserker getting second team is a big kind of indicator of that. In most seasons, a split like this, the talent that he showed in spring here would easily net you, first team All-Pro, MVP kind of talent, but unfortunately, there was just a lot of good players in this league. I picked Prince over Berserker. I totally understand the Berserker over Prince argument. I think you can make a solid case that Berserker over the back half of the season was more mechanically talented than a player like Prince. I just think that, Prince was maybe a little bit more important to the team's wins. Now, that's not to say that is always going to be the impact. Berserker could go on an absolute menace run through the playoffs and become playoff MVP, final MVP, do really well at MSI, all that stuff, and I would not be shocked at all. I'm really, really in on Berserker. I don't want anyone to take the second team as a negative for him. This is a really good placement amongst a really, really good group of bot laners. And then in the support position, another one that's going to shock a lot of people. I had Huhi on my first team. I've got Core JJ on my second team. Another player that I think is just not going to get the respect he deserves for the kind of split that he had because his team didn't necessarily have success. Yes, Team Liquid missed the playoffs, but Core was sensational all split long. He was, without a doubt, no contest the best player on that team in 2023. I think you can talk about, again, players like Pioshik, players like Summit, even Harry, being a little bit up and down. Yawn, not necessarily playing well every game. I can't think of a Core game where I was like, he's not great. And when they won games, when he got on champions that he could play make on, it's like, this is old Core JJ. It's just they weren't always in winning positions, and so he didn't always have the opportunity to kind of take the initiative in a lot of these situations. But to me, this was the same Core JJ that we had gotten, in a couple of years ago, right? It's just he didn't have the same kind of talent around him. I'm predicting that if Team Liquid can get a lot of their top side in check, if those players can play a lot more consistently, that by the end of the year, once we get through summer, we're going to be looking looking at Core right back in that, zone for top support in the entire region again. I think people are just going to overlook his spring split a bit because of team success. But overall, that's my second team. It's time to move on to the third team that I definitely think will ruffle some feathers, if you will. And move on to the third team we shall here, as it's going up on the screen right now. It's certainly going to raise some eyebrows for some of the players that maybe were left off of the list, but I'll go ahead and explain those when we get to them. My third team All-Pro in LCS Spring 2023 is looking like Dokla in the top lane from CLG. Jungle, it's Inspired from Evil Geniuses. In the mid lane, it's Palafox from CLG. In the bot lane, Double Lift from 100 Thieves. And in the support position, Vulcan from Evil Geniuses. Definitely some snubs here, but again, I'll get to them each position. In the top lane, I have Dokla. This does not feel like I'm putting any snubs out there. I think some people are going to want to see Someday in this position. He was probably the closest. I kind of debated back and forth. I think Someday was more consistent. Dokla certainly had more bad games over the course of the year, but I think Dokla had more good games over the course of the year than Someday. And honestly, I wanted to give a lot of credit to Dokla for how much he has improved over the course of the last few years. I think he was an all-pro caliber top laner this year, and I think that shows in CLG's record. A lot of people are going to underrate CLG's individual players because of how well this team plays as a unit, but their solo laners were specifically awesome this split. We'll get to Palafox in a bit, but Dokla, especially on those melee carries, obviously the Aurelia play stands out to everybody, but the Yone kind of really helped out this team a lot as well. He was good on tanks. He could really dominate in his lane. He was really good in team fights. He was just kind of a complete player over the course of the year. Dokla's not a name that I've heard a lot in terms of all-pro discussions, but in my opinion, he absolutely deserves to at least be in the conversation. He was really good for CLG over the course of the year, and, I think he was better than a lot of his contemporaries. Again, Someday was the other player that I was really considering for this spot, but I think Dokla in the end probably showed me a tad bit more explosiveness. I like Someday as much as anybody else, but Dokla was the guy for me getting that third team all-pro slot. In the jungle, I had Inspired. I'm a little bit torn on Inspired, right? Because I do think that he had a good split, good enough to be in the all-pro sections, but look at the player of the game points for the LCS. I think he's like second among all players. That is absolutely absurd. I don't think he had that kind of split. He's not first or second team. He's definitely a step down, in my opinion, from the first two junglers, but you gotta at least give him some credit for how well he was able to control the game in the mid-game for Evil Geniuses. You can talk about how this team really struggled to have an identity. I don't think Inspired was at fault for that. He was continuing to be aggressive. He was continuing to make plays. There just wasn't a lot of cohesion between him and the rest of the team. So I know people are a little bit lower on Evil Geniuses right now, but Inspired definitely deserves an all-pro spot, even if it's not like top 1 or 2, like maybe some of his Player of the Game awards would let you, kind of know. And then in the mid lane, it's Palafox. Now, this is the one that I think I'm probably going to get the most shit for, because this means that Gory is not on the list, and people are going to be real mad about that. But this is how I'll know who watches the, who actually listens to the video and who just types the comments. I like Gory a lot, and I think Gory is a better player than Palafox, than Maple, maybe even than Vikla, right? But I think the inconsistency that Gory showed in his ability to win games for his team by himself just put me in this spot. I think Palafox had a team around him that was a little bit more willing to invest into him, whereas Golden Guardians, really relied on Gory, and towards the end of the season, quite frankly, he kind of let them down. And so Palafox gets the nod. I want to talk a bit about Palafox more than I want to talk about Gory in this section. Palafox is just one of those players, man, that is just never going to get the respect that he deserves. This is the second split in a row where it feels like he has genuinely been outplaying players who have so much of a bigger narrative. Gory's a great example. Gory has this phenomenal narrative that he has dragged Golden Guardians out of the gutter basically by himself, and yet you go and watch what Gory's able to do and what Palafox is able to do, and they're very similar in terms of the actual effort that's put out on the Rift, like what they're actually able to create. Palafox is a game changer. He's someone that I'm sure LCS players do not overlook when they're facing each other. I really like his mechanics, but it's really his team fighting prowess. I think he might be one of the better team fighting mids in the entire region. You can talk about Bjergsen being in that category as well, but he's phenomenal on these picks that scale into the late game because he just knows how to survive and deal damage, and that's kind of a rare trait for mid laners in the LCS. And so Palafox hopefully doesn't get underrated too much longer. He's been really good over the course of this split, and I want to give him his flowers with this third team all-pro spot, which is exactly what I gave him in summer of last year as well. And then double lift. I don't exactly know how this is gonna land. A lot of people were considered for this spot. I feel so bad that FBI is not on this list. FBI was so good for Evil Geniuses this year. In my opinion, he was their best player. He was their most consistent player over the course of the year, and he certainly was the player that was inting the least when this team was going through most of its problems. But ADC was so stacked. Double lift made it. Stixay doesn't make it, which feels like an absolute travesty with how he played in the middle of the season. There were so many players that felt like they deserved to get this spot, but Double Lift ends up getting it. First of all, definitely needed to include someone from 100 Thieves, and Double Lift was the best player on that team, but I think generally speaking, we're forgetting about that little run of like a week and a half in the beginning part of the year where he really dominated. Couple that with everything he did towards the back half of the split where he was legitimately maybe the second best, third best AD carry in the LCS throughout the entire like second half of the split when 100 Thieves kind of got their shit together. Double Lift more than deserves his spot here on All Pro. I just feel bad because both FBI and Stixay also deserve this spot, but again, only 3 can go, and 2 are going to be taken by Prince and Berserker, so Double Lift gets the final nod from me. And then Vulcan gets the final support slot here. He's probably going to get first team on the LCS ballot, if I had to take a guess. And, I can definitely see why, but the inconsistency for Vulcan leads me to put him a little bit further down the list. I don't think he had the same kind of impact that players like Huhi and Core had consistently on winning lane. I think Vulcan, in his good games when, he beefed with somebody on Twitter and had a reason to invest himself into the game, was that, first team all-pro support that was taking over the game, being really good in the mid game, obviously having an impact with his jungler moving around the map, just being overall incredibly effective, but there was a good portion of the season where Vulcan just felt like mentally disconnected from a lot of these games, and that causes him to drop down a bit in my all-pro rankings. I just don't think that he was the most consistent, but talent-wise, like, he's number 1. He's the most talented support in the league, and I would expect him to kind of bounce back. Quote-unquote, he's probably still going to get first team, but I would expect him to be even better as we get into summer, but those are my all-pro choices. I know some of them are going to be a little bit controversial, but I'd love to hear you guys' in the comment section below. Of course, keep the conversation civil. It's not usually a great idea to start your comment with "you're a moron" for these picks, and these are what I would do. We might have different criteria. Again, I value active wins gained rather than mechanical skill a little bit more. Maybe you value the other. I'd love to have that conversation with you, and we're never going to have the same picks. If we did, we'd all be robots, but I'd love to hear what you guys' thoughts are down in the comment section below. But now that we've gone over all the awards, now that we've gone over all the controversial stuff, it's time to get into my playoff picks, starting with round number 1. Now it's time to get into our round 1 discussions. We're going to be going over all 6 teams that are in the playoffs, but I'm going to be kicking it off with our first 4 seeds. I like to go in order and seeding order, and so we're going to be kicking it off with our first round matchups first because of how the bracket works. Of course, top 4 teams are already in upper bracket. Bottom 2 teams start in loser's bracket. So while the top 4 teams do get kind of a second life, if you will, in the tournament, the bottom 2 teams do not. 5 and 6 seeds do not get that. We'll talk about them at the end and some of the potential options that they might have, considering who they might face in that next round and just kind of going over their play style. But generally here, I'm going to be talking about who I think is going to be big for each individual team during their playoff run. So let's start it off with our number 1 seed versus number 4 seed matchup. It's going to be the number 1 seed in the LCS, Cloud9, taking on the number 4 seed, Counter Logic Gaming. These 2 teams faced off in the first round of the playoffs last summer as well, so detailing this is going to be pretty similar considering CLG has the same roster and C9 only switched out mid laners. A lot of the conversation that kind of surrounded that game is definitely going to continue to surround this one. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Starting with Cloud9, our number 1 seed in the LCS in the regular season. They won the tiebreaker over FlyQuest to claim that spot. They were in second for a majority of the regular season, but they surged towards the end of the split. Maybe not in their final game against CLG, which we definitely will talk about, but overall, Cloud9 still looking really good this regular season. I've already talked about all these players pretty much in depth, with the exception of Sven. I probably should have mentioned Sven as an honorable mention in the All-Pro section. He absolutely should be an honorable mention. He is somewhere in that, 1 to 5 range. I feel like there isn't a ton of separation from the supports. If you want to put Sven in the first team, I honestly wouldn't even really argue with you that much. Support can honestly go in a lot of different ways. I just ended up not putting him in because I didn't think he was the most noticeable impact, but surely, Sven is talented enough to deserve an all-pro spot, so I'm not going to complain at all about that. You'll also notice some numbers on the screen. You'll notice a 1 next to Fudge, a 2 next to Blabber, etc. That's just going to show you if they did end up making an all-pro, in my my projected all-pro kind of rankings. Nothing really too important there. I'm not doing player rankings now. You're going to have to wait until the beginning of summer for those, but let's go ahead and talk about how Cloud9 likes to play the game. This team is very fast and they're very aggressive, which was not always their style. At the beginning of the year, they really liked playing towards topside. They really wanted to make sure that Fudge was on a counterpick matchup that they could do a lot with, but as the year has gone along, as Emenis has joined this team in the mid lane, they've really unlocked a lot of different options for this team, just in general, kind of. Blabber and Emenis are two very mechanically talented players that often are able to generate their own leads, basically irrelevant of anything else in the early game, and then they use that to enable each other. Blabber fights a lot more now. Emenis is someone who is shoving and roaming and trying to get out on the map. You can see that with LeBlanc being one of his higher played champions. You can see a lot of Wukong, a lot of Elise coming out from Blabber. These champions that do really want to try to create chaos as early as possible. That's not to say that they don't want to play through their side lanes, but I do think that the focal point of how they want to play through the early game and definitely where they like to invest their resources is definitely the mid lane as of when Emenis joined this team. Now, I would like to see Fudge get involved a bit more in the playoffs. He's someone who I think is ridiculously consistent. You can see a lot of Sion, a lot of Cassante, most of that coming out in the back half of the split. The Jax was really working for this team. Even something like the Fiora was really working for this team at the beginning of the year. That is something I'd really like to see, especially into a matchup with Dokla, who can be a little bit more feast or famine as a top laner. You can take advantage of some of his more aggressive plays, let's say, and you can definitely make him look a little bit, up and down on some of the champions that he ends up pulling out there. And so I would expect Fudge to maybe get a little bit more resources. Berserker and Sven, for as good as they are, and they're probably the most consistent bot lane in the league, maybe outside of FlyQuest, but I think as a duo, they're probably number one. They don't really get a lot of attention from jungle. They are pretty self-sustainable, I guess is the word you would put, down in the bot lane. Berserker's just really good at being able to generate leads on his own, and so Cloud9 doesn't really feel a lot of need to invest a lot into that bot side. Now, they will in circumstances where they want to pick something like the Draven, although not nearly as much as I think they should. Berserker, often enough, can just be left on his own with Sven down in the bot lane, and they'll figure it out. They'll be able to make it work. They will look strong, basically no matter what they end up playing. That gives Cloud9 a lot of flexibility, but obviously, if you want to play to Berserker, if you want to play to Sven, they are more than capable of being able to uphold that. And so Cloud9's a very difficult team to pin down because they really can play through every avenue, but what I've noticed is that they really like to get mid opened up. They like to get Emenis ahead, and then they like to get him out on the map so that they can start taking a lot of skirmishes, 3v3s, 4v4s in the mid game and fight over objectives. As for CLG on the other side, very different approach. They are still really good in the mid game, but this team likes to scale a tad bit more than Cloud9. They're not going to be this super aggressive offensive team in the early game, and most of that can be seen in their jungler, Contracts, who in past years has been a very aggressive early game jungler, somebody who dominates the statistics in deaths in all-time LCS categories. If he had played more splits, he would by far be the leader in that category by now, but he's kind of been on tank duty all year long. The Sejuani's been a massive pick for this team, but even the Maokai, the Vi, things like that, that's really been the ideology that CLG wants to go for. Things that can kind of guide him through the early game. He doesn't have to feel like he's in a rush to make a lot of plays, and then he can rely on his two solo laners and his incredibly talented AD carry to be these big carries in the back half of the game. Dokla, Palafox have each kind of taken turns being that. Dokla, I don't think his champion pool on screen necessarily reflects like what he has been the most successful on. It's his most played champions like Sion and Gwen and things like that. But like I said earlier, the Aurelia, the Yone, those are the things that you really have to worry about when it comes to CLG. If he gets on some of those picks, he can cause a lot of havoc in the mid game, in the early game as well, but mostly in the mid to late game, in these kind of objective-oriented, like small closed area, jungle fights, if you will. That Yone ult can be a problem, Aurelia getting her resets and getting that healing can be a problem. Dokla's just very difficult to deal with in the mid to late game. Very strong team fighter, and the same can be said about Palafox in the mid lane. I really do like his Aurelion Soul. It's been his #1 pick ever since that champion got reworked midway through the split. Not necessarily respected in terms of the win-loss record 1 and 2, but he was actually fantastic in all 3 of those games. I remember one in particular that they lost where he was like 8-0 and 11, and it's like, how do you lose this game? But he's really good at that kind of play style. He can pull out some of the early game shove and roamers like the Jace, like the Talia, but team fighting has always been Palafox's strength in my opinion, and I think the same can be said about Dokla. Now, Luger and Poom in the bot lane, they're more of the early game mindset, which is crazy to say because a lot of Zeri and a lot of Sivir coming out from this bot lane in the regular season, but I really like Luger's Kalista. I think that's something to be afraid of, and I think that could be a lane that CLG might want to try and take advantage of. Cloud9, not necessarily a bad bot lane, but kind of notoriously not giving a lot of jungle attention and jungle proximity to Berserker and Sven. That could be something that CLG tries to counteract, although you do run the risk of just getting 2v3'd by an incredibly talented bot lane. But overall, I would say that you're looking at a more aggressive early game team into a team that is a little bit more comfortable scaling up, but in the LCS, it's more so just going to be about who executes, I should say, on their comp better. But that's going to lead me into my key matchup of the series, which for me is going to be that top lane matchup, Fudge and Dokla. In that top lane. I really do think this is where a lot of the differences are going to be created. I think both of these teams, more so than almost any other teams in the LCS, like to run through top lane. C9 wants to get Fudge ahead. They want to get Blabber and Eminus on the move so that they can get Fudge in a really positive spot. And I mean, the stats back it up. The dude was utterly dominant. First in KP percentage, second in damage percentage, second in first blood percentage, second in solo kills, first in KDA. Like, a ridiculous stat line coming out here for Fudge. He was the best top laner in the league, and C9 knew that. They wanted to invest in him for it. But Dokla, you know, maybe he doesn't have the necessarily, like, consistent statistics, but the dude was incredibly good when he had his good games. Honestly, his best games do rival Fudge, and that's why, to me, this is the key matchup. You're seeing, like, third in GD at 15, third in damage percentage, fourth in KP percentage. That doesn't necessarily tell the story of when he pops off, he really pops off. If you get a really good day out of Dokla, this matchup is going to be a lot more difficult for Cloud9, but if Fudge can really neutralize a lot of the pressure that's coming out from the top side of the map, CLG doesn't really have a lot of other avenues for them to be able to consistently pressure their leads. And so top lane, in my opinion, against all odds in 2023 is going to be my key matchup in this series. And I, for one, am just really excited to see this. They were really fun teams to watch. They split 1-1 in the regular season, but CLG taking that game to kind of secure themselves into this pretty nice spot in the last game of this regular season, you know, not including tiebreakers. There's a lot of interesting storylines going into this, and I do think that CLG is in a position where they could theoretically upset Cloud9. I'm just not entirely sure if that's going to happen. You're going to have to wait until my bracket prediction at the end of the video to know who I'm picking in this series, but definitely one team is a little bit favored over the other. I will finish at that. And then moving on to our other round 1 winners matchup here. We already talked about 1 versus 4. It's time to talk about 2 versus 3, and this one is definitely the more interesting of the two. We had the number 2 seeded FlyQuest taking on the number 3 seeded 100 Thieves, and both of these teams definitely moving in opposite directions to get here. FlyQuest has been the number 1 team in the league for quite a long time, for almost the entirety of the split. They were the number 1 team in the standings, but they faltered it down the stretch. They ended up not being able to take it home. They ended up tying and losing the tiebreaker to Cloud9 in order to get the second seed. 100 Thieves, on the other hand, was out of the playoffs heading into the final week of the season. They needed a miracle run, and they got it. They have won, their last 7 games, if you include tiebreakers, something ludicrous like that. And now, they're the 3 seed. They won all the tiebreakers, they won all of their games in the final week of the season, and everything has really been clicking for this 100 Thieves team. And so, moving in different directions, but I'm going to talk about why I think that's not necessarily something that might translate into the playoffs, and I'll go ahead and explain that when we get to 100 Thieves. But we'll talk about FlyQuest first and foremost. Again, another team where I've already talked about almost every player on the team. The only player that I really haven't brought up is Ayla. Now, Ayla is a very interesting case here for FlyQuest because he is incredibly talented. He is, you know, the player that I put my money in with in terms of Rookie of the Year voting, right? Like, at the beginning of the year, Ayla was the one that I was, like, hitching my wagon towards. Not Busio, not Jan, not Harry, not any of these other really well-performing Academy players, even his teammates. It was always Ayla for me, and that was because of what he was able to show in Academy. He was, in my opinion, easily the best player out of that group already, but some crazy things happened this split. You know, poor Ayla had some major visa issues. He's only able to make it in basically for the second half of the season, maybe even a little less than that. And this team got a really good start. This team was really, really good without him. And I can see where, you know, maybe him coming in, not being fluent in Korean, him having to adopt to a team dynamic that has already formed. That's the big thing for me, is it's not that, you know, Ayla didn't necessarily, you know, get a chance to, you know, learn with Prince and whatever, right? It's the fact that all of these players with Winsome had already formed their dynamic of how they want to talk, who's going to be speaking in team fights, how they want to, you know, who's going to be leading the charge in terms of early game calls. Like, all of that, all of those dynamics that you have to form as a team had already been established before Ayla came in, and he had to try and integrate himself into that. It was a little bit of a rough beginning of the split for him. He didn't have the best spring split, but I do think talent-wise, he's right up there with almost anybody in the LCS. And if he can get it together, if he can get on the same page as the rest of this team, he can be one of the best supports in the entire region. And when you pair that up with 4 players who just made All-Pro teams, at the very worst, second-team All-Pro for me, that's a pretty dangerous combination. Impact has been incredibly solid on the top side, we're seeing some tanks, but he started to pull out the Jax a little bit more towards the back half of the year. We know that Impact can be a little bit aggressive and that they can kind of let him do his thing, but again, still a little bit worried about his consistency when it comes to laning, especially in a matchup like this against Tenacity, who, you know, for all of his flaws, is an incredibly proficient laner and is known to be able to generate leads relatively consistently. And so that's certainly something to consider with Impact, probably on tank duty if I'm going to have to guess this entire series. Spica, much more interesting. Again, a lot of tanks from him, very similar to what we said when we were talking about contracts, but I actually think that Spica does a lot better on more aggressive picks than maybe people give him credit for. Obviously, we've seen a lot of things like a Mumu. Those are engagers. Those are things that you want to try and play really aggressively. Yes, Maokai and Vi and Sedge can kind of be played in a similar way, and Spica often does, but I would consider his aggressive engage playstyle to be like the best way to get the best out of Spica. You know, the Lilias of the world, the Amumus of the world. That's what I kind of associate with Spica, and I imagine that's something they might want to pull out a little bit more efficiently in this series, going up against someone like Closer, who has been pretty hit or miss over the course of the season. Spica's mechanically talented, but I can also see them just defaulting to something that can enable a lot of the lanes, because you do have arguably the best mid-bot duo in the entire league, and I think they have it. You know, I know some people are going to argue that, but Vikla and Prince are just really freaking good at the game of League of Legends. Vikla gets a bad rap, but he can carry on basically anything. Melee, range, supportive, aggressive, early game, late game. It doesn't really matter. Vikla's just a very flexible player that can kind of do a lot. Now, he's not perfect. I don't think that there is any elite talent in the mid lane in the LCS right now, and that includes Vikla. He can be exploited. I just don't know in this matchup if that's going to happen. I would expect Vikla to kind of jump on a lot of early game champions here and see how he does on that. And then Prince is just going to be on whatever he wants. He can play early, he can play late. We're seeing Zeri, we're seeing Aphelios, we're seeing Caitlyn. You know, whatever you need to pull out, it's probably going to work with Prince because this team just plays around him so well. Now, one thing to note, 100 Thieves probably has scouted this team a bit, obviously going into playoffs, and what FlyQuest has kind of shown is that if Prince doesn't really get this gigantic early lead, they can struggle in the mid game knowing what to do. They're not mechanically, you know, struggling, but they are mechanically, or they're mentally struggling, I should say, with their macro. Prince is a big part of the game plan when it comes to FlyQuest, and so that could be something that Fly has to look out for. A lot of early pressure down in the bot lane from the other team, but if they can survive that, if they can get Prince ahead, if they can get Spica, Vikla ahead, this series should be relatively similar to both of the games that these two teams played in the regular season where FlyQuest was able to take them both. As for 100 Thieves on the other side, only one player on this team made All-Pro. That is the least amount of any of the teams in the top 4. However, a lot of that is just because 100 Thieves didn't decide to be good until the last, 5 games of the year. But those last 5 games were so ridiculously strong that this team is in a much better spot than maybe a lot of people thought they would be at this point. Let's start talking about their players. Tenacity in the top lane, somebody who was a more carry-oriented player throughout his time in Academy, somebody who I thought really needed to play that more resource-heavy style, but ever since he switched over to playing the meatballs, the Scion, the Gragas, he's been a lot more efficient and a lot better in lane, quite frankly. I think that's a style that they will continue to go to. Tenacity being a little bit more weak side top. He's still really strong in terms of laning pressure. He just doesn't need a lot of the resources in order to get it done. And then Closer in the jungle. I was super critical of Closer over the course of the year, up until their winning streak, because he was one of the worst junglers in the league for the first, I would say 3 quarters of the split. The last quarter, though, he really figured it out. It felt like he finally got on the same page as Bjergsen in the mid lane, and they finally had an idea of how they wanted to play the early game. This team, which we'll get to, it's a little bit of a theme, likes to scale. They are the scaling team in the LCS. I've compared them to 2016, 2017 TSM. I think they play very similar styles, not just because of Bjergsen and Doublelift, but just the mentality of how they play the game. They always seem to be close in gold. And I think Closer is a little bit of a newbie to that style. He's definitely somebody who likes to generate his early pressure, but he's done a lot better in recent weeks, picking up some of the picks that he can be a little bit more passive on in the early game and then trying to take over in the mid game with their macro that is spectacular. And that really is where I bring in Bjergsen into the conversation. I know Bjerg gets a bad rap for wanting to wait until late game and not being as proactive as a lot of the other mid laners in the early game, but he might be the best mid-game team fighter in the entire league. He truthfully might have that record, whether it's on carries or on supportive picks. He is always relevant in the late game. It does not matter how the early game has gone for him. He is phenomenal at positioning. He is phenomenal at knowing how to get the best out of his champions, and that's really where 100 Thieves starts to play to their strengths, is when they get to that mid to late game. Doublelift, great late game team fighter. He's had some good laning phases. I would say he is probably the best player to play to if you want to try and do stuff early, but that's what they were doing in their losing stretch, and they just weren't able to get a lot done with it. Doublelift adapting to the Zeri, even playing stuff like the Jinx, the hyper carries that not a lot of other people in the LCS are bringing out, I think has really helped 100 Thieves a lot. And Busio, it's going to be Rakan, and more Rakan coming out from Busio. That's what he's played basically all of the winning streak. We've seen some Renata, we've seen some Lulu, but for the most part, that Rakan is a massive pick for 100 Thieves. I would be shocked if this pick was not permabanned against 100 Thieves in the playoffs. It's just too much of a massive pick for Busio, and that's going to start to raise some questions. He hasn't been nearly as proficient on other champions. He played it in both of the tiebreaker games as well as almost all of their final 7. It's going to be interesting to see how teams adapt to it, but if he gets it, he's going to dominate. And by that factor, obviously, Xayah is going to be a big pick for Doublelift. But these are two teams that definitely like to go late, like to team fight. And what kind of role exemplifies late game team fighting? It's the key matchup of the series. It's the bot laners. It has to be. How can it not be? It's Prince and it's Doublelift. Now, stats-wise, it's very different for both of these players. You can see Doublelift's stats look a lot better. I don't think that matches with what we've seen on the Rift. I trust my eyes more than I trust the numbers. I've said that for years and years and years, but it does give a good glimpse into the fact that Fly typically likes to play a little bit around everyone, whereas 100 Thieves does invest a lot more into Doublelift. This could be a matchup where FlyQuest is able to get the lead in the bot lane in multiple games in a row, that it could really swing out of favor for 100 Thieves. They don't really have a lot of backup plans for their early game outside of Doublelift, but Doublelift is an extremely proficient laner. Him and Busio have gotten a lot more chemistry over the course of the year, and they've really found a style that works out for them. I think if they are able to kind of stand their own and maybe even generate leads in the 2v2, 100 Thieves is an incredibly scary team to run into in the playoffs here, and I really do think that there is an opportunity for that team to be able to grasp a lot of the success that they are looking for out of the bot lane, out of the MVP's hands. But if we get MVP level Prince, the Prince that we got for the first 5 weeks of the season, this shouldn't really be a close bot lane contest. As good as I think Doublelift is, Prince needs to play his game. If he can get that, if Ayla can be a little bit more efficient, FlyQuest is going to be very difficult to take down. But in my opinion, bot lane will decide almost everything in this series, and these two players are going to be the center of everyone's attention. But now moving on into our 5 and 6 seeds, we've talked about the first round matchups. It's time to get into the other two teams that aren't going to know their opponents until those matchups actually happen. And starting with the 5th seed here, we are going to have a breakdown of Evil Geniuses. Now, them dropping to losers bracket, dropping down to the number 5 seed is an actual disaster for this team. They finished out the season about as poorly as you could in 0-3 in the final week. They did not have any sort of pressure. And, they didn't look all that competitive in the tiebreaker either. This was a team that was consistently in the top 3 basically the entirety of the split. They were tough against Cloud9. They beat FlyQuest. This was a good Evil Geniuses team that just couldn't get the job done in the back half of the season. How do I think that's going to translate? Well, I think it's definitely going to be interesting. Someday Inspire, JoJo, FBI, Vulcan. We know the lineup. We know how they've played, so let's go ahead and talk about kind of their play style and what I expect this team to be looking at in terms of, things that they want to try and play towards in the playoffs. I think mostly for Evil Geniuses, the reason that they're sitting here in 5th and not in 2nd, not in 3rd, hell, not even in 1st, right, is because they fumble the bag so much in the mid to late game. These are incredibly talented players, Inspired and JoJo in particular, who are able to generate strong leads on their own in their own matchups. Inspired has been one of the more dominant early game junglers. JoJo's stats are out of this world, obviously not followed up by his late game performances. We will get to that. And FBI and Vulcan have been a really good bot lane as well, but generally speaking, Evil Geniuses has absolutely no idea what to do in the mid game. They lack a very strong sense of game plan and macro, and I'm not really sure why. This is the part of the game that they really excelled at last year, with 3 of the 5 players returning, being your mid, your jungle, and your support, your 3 most vocal people, I would imagine, are being the shot callers here, and it just feels like this team has entirely changed how they want to play the game. It's never going to be about talent for Evil Geniuses. It's almost always going to be about how they can function that talent into a win, how they can take their gold advantages and turn them into wins themselves. They're 3rd in the league in gold diff at 15, and they're last in the league in gold duration. That is unacceptable. 8th in dragon percentage. I imagine their Baron percentage is very low as well. They just don't play for objectives, so Let's go ahead and talk about maybe the game plan that they might want to go to. This team really relies on Inspired to generate early leads in the jungle for them. Evil Geniuses, more so than almost any other team in the league, really needs jungle pressure because they play so aggro in their lanes. JoJo is always pushed up. FBI and Vulcan are almost always pushed up. Some days willing to take a little bit of a back seat, but if Inspired's not playing well, if Inspired doesn't have a lot of prio and a lot of pressure in that jungle and isn't in the right place on the map, these are very exploitable lanes for Evil Geniuses, and we've seen that when this team has been behind in the early game. So Inspired getting ahead on picks like Sedge, Maokai, Vi, the Wukong's been coming out this year, is super important. If Inspired is able to generate strong leads against the team that he's playing against, this team is in a position to actually be able to compete against almost anybody because Inspired is really solid and they are able to pretty consistently generate leads even against good teams. Jojo Pume has been probably the most mechanically talented mid laner in this split, but God, the amount of games that he has thrown away being in the wrong place at the wrong time or taking the bad fight when he doesn't need to, it's just frustrating. There are so many players in the league that have the mechanical talent that is so much lower than JoJo, and that, in my opinion, offered so much more to their team this year. I still have faith that JoJo should and can be the best mid laner in the region, that he has more potential, mechanically speaking, than anybody else in the LCS. He just needs to put it together. I've been talking about how this split has been so much more similar to his, debut split in spring of last year rather than the Evil Geniuses that we saw come out of MSI and go into summer, because it really felt like a lot of the regressions that he made in terms of overextending, in terms of taking plays that are just bad ideas, weren't sustainable for him, and I hope that he's going to be able to kind of get those out in the playoffs. But if I had to expect something, and I'll get to bot lane in a second, I think this team is still just going to be very coin flippy and very much feast or famine in terms of how they play the game. If JoJo is having a good game, and if Inspired and JoJo generate large leads, then they're going to be fine. But that brings us to the bot lane here. FBI and Vulcan, they're probably the part of the team that I'm the least worried about. FBI and Vulcan have just generally been really solid over the course of the year. Even in their losses, this team wins lane, bot lane almost every game, and no one talks about it. I don't understand. I haven't really heard anybody mention FBI in the All-Pro conversation, and I think that is incredibly disrespectful. He's been the best player on this team, in my opinion. I know that doesn't show in the All-Pro categories, but like I said, bot lane, fourth is much more valuable than, support third or jungle third, in my opinion. But FBI's just been really, really good over the course of the year, and Vulcan's really helped with that. Their 2v2 has been great. I think a lot of people were really worried about whether FBI was going to be able to step into Danny's shoes. They're very different players. I think FBI has been a lot more focused on the early game, whereas Danny was a lot more focused on the late game, and I think FBI is more consistent, whereas Danny had bigger pop-off moments. But either way you want to slice it, FBI has been good for this team and a positive force, and I do think they can play through him, but that's not really how they like to play the game. They like to play through JoJo. They like to play through Inspired. If those two can get strong leads, they can beat anybody in the region, period. They can beat Cloud9, they can beat FlyQuest, they can beat 100 Thieves, they can beat CLG. It does not matter, but it's going to be about whether or not they can consistently generate those leads and then actually turn them into something. If they can do that, then maybe Evil Geniuses will actually reach the potential that I think a lot of us had set for them at the beginning of the year. And lastly, moving on to our 6th seed and our final team to talk about in this video in the LCS playoffs, a team that barely ended up making it into playoffs with a 500 record, but really should have done it a lot more comfortably. This team was looking like a top 2, top 3 team for parts of this split. Of course, I'm talking about Golden Guardians. They were really, really good over the middle stretch. They were taking care of business. They started off the split 0-4, went on an 7 or 8, one of those two, game win streak, and then ended the season at 9-9. Incredibly streaky stuff coming out from Golden Guardians. And quite frankly, it's not exactly inspiring to see how they ended the split. Their lineup was looking like Licorice in the top lane, River in the jungle, Gory in the mid lane, Stixay at AD carry, and Huhi at support. Of course, only Huhi getting an All-Pro nod, but Gory was definitely in the mentions. He'll probably get a super high All-Pro nod in terms of the LCS, because the narrative around Golden Guardians has really been Gory this year. And then Stixay definitely deserves to be in the conversation. River probably as well, but he had a horrendous final couple of weeks of the season, and I just think it was a little much to knock him out of the overall picture for me. But this team definitely has talent. Like, you can't say that they're not talented. My worry with this team is that their main players are either going to win them or lose them the game, right? River, Gory, Huhi. Those are the players that matter on Golden Guardians. I love Stixay. I think he's been good this split. Licorice, you know, I'm a little bit lower on him, but generally speaking, when River and Gory play well in the mid-jungle duo and they're able to generate a strong lead and Gory gets ahead, this team wins. When they don't, this team loses. That kind of has been the story for Golden Guardians. The rest of the players on the team really aren't up to the task of being able to pick up the team when those two aren't doing well, which does raise some questions. So I'm going to go player by player again because that's what I do here, but I'll get to playstyle in a bit. Licorice in the top lane. I think if you are going to find a weakness from a team in the playoffs, this is probably the biggest one, and I hate saying that because I love Licorice as a person and as a player and everything he's done for the LCS, but I just think he's been carried a lot for Golden Guardians this split. He's been a lot better, let me tell you, a lot better over the second half, but he had a miserable end to 2022, and he was really not good at the start of the year. Even when this team was winning, he was pulling out the Renekton and the Scion and the Jax, and it was just like, dude, like, let your team carry you. It was honestly frustrating a bit. I know there are Licorice defenders out there, but I'm not going to hide my opinion and my feelings. I think Licorice is the biggest weak link in the playoffs, and that's definitely something other teams might be able to exploit, but, you know, he's got, you know, at his best, he's a good weak side top. He's not going to win you games. You're just kind of hoping he doesn't lose you games. I'm going to talk about Jungle Maiden, kind of a duo here, because I do think it matters that to pair them together. Both of them are pretty feast or famine. River especially is feast or famine. We've talked about this in the past, but I was a little bit lower on River coming out of 2022. A lot of people were super high on his performance with Dignitas. The ups and the downs were certainly there. There were a lot more downs than people were giving him credit for, and I think a lot of those have started to come back out in 2023 towards the back half of the split, mostly on these aggressive champions. He's looked a lot better on things like Vi and Sejuani, but you put him on the Wukong, you put him on the Elise. It's not working out nearly as well as a lot of these other junglers, and I think it opens up a hole for Golden Guardians that a lot of teams I think are going to try to exploit, which is Gory's entire impact in the mid lane. He is an incredibly mechanically talented player, but a player can only do so much when he is the focal point of every bit of aggression from the enemy team. And teams have realized now that if they attack Gory, if he goes even, if he goes, you know, negative, which he has done in a lot of games in the recent weeks, this team doesn't have a backup plan. They really don't have any other ways of going about it. He is a very aggressive player. He's someone who's going to try to look for crazy plays on his LeBlanc, on his Yone, on his Sylas. You know, these are picks that I think we would associate with a player like Zeka less than we would associate with a player like, I don't know, Showmaker, right? That kind of play style where it's a little bit more all or nothing. And I think Gory sometimes comes up with nothing because enemy team can run in the way, or his own team doesn't necessarily have the lead to be able to push into him. I think there are a lot of parallels between him and JoJo. I do think he has been better than JoJo over the course of the year, but I think he's got a lot less around him to be able to work with. You're really hoping that Gory is going to be able to step up and be the MVP of this team in the playoffs, but over the last part of the split, it's really not been all that good for him. I think River and Gory are by far important players for Golden Guardian's success here in the playoffs, and it's really going to be up to them. They are incredibly talented, but a little bit inconsistent for me to feel like completely justified and completely safe in them as players. And then there's Stixxay and Huhi. They're fine. They're going to look really good. Stixxay in particular, it's going to look really good when this team is rolling, when River has a huge lead in the jungle, and when Gory is moving around on the map. They are really good at giving a lot of gold and letting Stixxay feel comfortable playing that aggressive style that he's always been known for. But when this team is losing, Stixxay's not going to dig you out of that hole. He's not one of the best ADCs in the region. Now, I love Stixxay to death, and I think he's had a great bounce back year, but he's not going to be that guy that can take over the game when River and Gory are not having that moment. That's why I say it is so crucial for mid and jungle to win, because if they don't, I just don't know if Stixxay's the kind of player that's going to pull them out. He's been solid in the early game. I mean, the Ezreal's always going to be good, but, you know, Lucian Nami's been big for this team. I think Zeri in general, Zeri Lulu mostly, has been big for this team. There are a lot of, you know, good things here, and I do think they win often in the 2v2, but I just worry about him being the main carry for Golden Guardians, because especially towards the back half of the split, Stixxay and Huhi were doing fine in lane, River and Gory were getting a lot of pressure and losing, and Golden Guardians had nothing to do in the mid to late game, and that concerns me. Huhi, first team all-pro support, kind of switching gears a bit. He's just been everything you want out of a support, but you can only do so much out of that position. He's been great in lane. There's a reason Golden Guardians lane stats are so ridiculous, but his ability to roam and play with River is what generates a lot of those leads for Gory in the mid lane. If they can continue to get him ahead, if Huhi can continue to create a lot of pressure for River in that jungle to be able to, you know, move around the map or invade the enemy jungle or just perma-camp bot or whatever they end up wanting to do, that's going to be massive for this team. Again, I don't really have worries about Huhi. He is the most consistent player on this team. Stixxay is consistent, but he doesn't necessarily have the same highs and upsides. I think that this team could be incredibly scary. Just a couple of weeks ago, we were considering them a top 2 team in the league, a potential MSI representative, but now I'm really worried about how this team, is going to fare in the playoffs. I think teams have kind of figured them out. If I'm being entirely honest, they have figured out that River and Gory are the focal points and that the rest of the team really doesn't step up when those two don't play, and so I can imagine a lot of pressure being thrown into the mid and jungle. It's going to be either up to River and Gory to generate those leads, or it's going to be up to Stixay and Licorice to be able to prove me wrong and show that even if River and Gory aren't having perfect games, those two can be your catalysts. Right now, I'm leaning a little bit more towards the negative aspect, but Golden Guardians does have a lot of upside, and they've shown what they can be at a top level. We'll just have to see if that's what they are in the playoffs. All right, that is going to do it for my LCS playoff primer. All 6 teams overviewed, all 2 matchups analyzed, try to go for the overview and analysis thing. You guys know what I do on this channel. Up on the screen now, you're going to see a bracket template. Let's go ahead and fill it out. Now, reminder, this is going to be my predictions. This is not going to go entirely correct. If I get this all correct, someone come back in the comment section and be like, you're a genius, because that's insane. Like, statistically speaking, that's just not going to happen. But these are just going to be my predictions. Now, how I like to do this is I like to go through each series, maybe talk a bit about the matchup, and then give my prediction for who will win and how many games they will win it in. I like to give a 1-game spread, so if I pick a team, 3-1, I might say, C9 3-1 or C9 3-2. Like, that's my 2-game spread, because I feel like that's reasonable. It's not particularly easy to guess it in one guess, but it'll kind of give you an idea of whether I think a series is just a blowaway or whether I think these teams might actually be relatively close. So, let's go ahead and go over it here. Starting off with our first series, our 1-4 matchup in Winners Round 1, Cloud9 versus CLG. And if you could probably guess from me previewing the series, I'm going to predict Cloud9 in this one. I really do think they should just be the better team. I know CLG was able to take a game in the final week of the season, but Cloud9's really rolling, and I think they were kind of taking that game a little bit too loosely. They kind of misplayed rather than CLG playing up to expectations, in my opinion, and so I'm going to take Cloud9. I'm going to take them 3-0 or 3-1. They should just be able to handle this series. I think CLG could snag a game, but I would more so expect C9 to come focused and come ready to kind of bounce back against a CLG team that they should just be able to beat. And then the other Winners Round 1 matchup, FlyQuest versus 100 Thieves. Now, this is maybe the most interesting matchup in the entire tournament to go over. And I'm actually going to go 100 Thieves on this one. They're going to be picking up the win in the first round here, I guess you could say, moving on to that winners finals, if you will. A lot of people are going to go FlyQuest. I think 100 Thieves is absolutely rolling right now, and FlyQuest needs to get out of their own head. I think a loss might, do them good. It might also do them real bad to go down into the lower bracket, but either way, I think 100 Thieves should be able to take it. My 2-game spread, 100 Thieves 3-2, FlyQuest 3-2. I do think that this is a little bit of a 50-50 coin flip. I think if you get a good version of FlyQuest, they should be able to win, but if 100 Thieves plays their game and they get to that late game and they can team fight, they can really win this series, and so I think it'll be close, but I think 100 Thieves is going to be able to take it in the end. That leaves us with our 2 losers matchups being, CLG and FlyQuest dropping to losers round 1 here, facing off against the 2 bottom seeds, and so let's go ahead and go over those, starting with CLG versus Golden Guardians. This is a rematch again, another rematch. We've had a lot of these of playoffs last year, of losers bracket last year. Golden Guardians definitely gave a good CLG team a run for their money, and I think they'll do so again, but CLG should be able to pick up the win here. Now, I feel really bad for Golden Guardians. I think that this team is, mechanically talented. They're better than people gave them credit for, but they're probably the easiest out in the tournament if I had to guess, and I think CLG just as a unit is more cohesive. I could definitely see a world in which Golden Guardians wins this, but I'm going to go CLG. My spread is going to be CLG 3-1, CLG 3-2. That's my spread. I think Golden Guardians should be able to hold their own against a team like CLG, but they should be able to come out on top in this one. And then we've got another really intriguing series, FlyQuest versus Evil Geniuses. 2 of the more talented teams in the entire league going head-to-head. And I have FlyQuest being able to pick this one up. How insane would it be if I had FlyQuest going out as one of the bottom 2 teams in playoffs? I don't think it's completely unreasonable with how this bracket is set up, but FlyQuest should be able to take down the more less flexible, I should say, Evil Geniuses team that really isn't going to be able to adapt. I think FlyQuest is a really, really good team that really just needs to get their head back on their shoulders. My spread, though, for this, FlyQuest 3-2, EG 3-2. I could see a world in which EG is actually stepping up, really plays some of the best league they played all year, and is actually able to take this, but FlyQuest is going to be my safe pick for now. I feel really bad for Evil Geniuses, because I actually think if this bracket ended up getting flipped, if 2 ended up playing 6, if 4 ended up playing 5, I think they beat CLG. My prediction if they played CLG would be EG in 4. I think EG 3-1 would be my prediction if they ended up playing a team like CLG, but unfortunately, with how the bracket works, this is how the cookie crumbles. They will either be playing FlyQuest or 100 Thieves, I believe. Tell me, obviously, in the comment section if I'm wrong about that, but, you know, in case I am wrong, I'm putting it out there. I think Evil Geniuses would beat CLG, but I do not think they would beat FlyQuest. So let's go ahead and talk about our Winners Finals now. Winners Finals is definitely an intriguing one. Cloud9, 100 Thieves. I'm really excited to see these two teams face off against each other because 100T has not played, you know, Cloud9 ever since their kind of resurrection. And I do think this would be a lot of fun, but I'm going to lean in Cloud9's direction. They should be the one to head to Winners Finals or Grand Finals from the winner's side of the bracket. 100 Thieves is going to be losing this series. I do think they've been on a magnificent run, but Cloud9's just on a different level. I think if you get them locked in mentally, they should just be the better team. Blabber is really good into closer. Those are two players that have always done relatively well into each other, and I think if there's any bot lane that Doublelift and Busio aren't going to be able to dominate in the early game, it is almost certainly Berserker and Sven, who have a really good, you know, consistent early game strategy, and so I'm going to go Cloud9 in this one. I'm going to go Cloud9 3-1, Cloud9 3-2. I do think 100 Thieves could definitely give them a run for their money, but Cloud9 should be able to take this series in the end. And then we've got, you know, our losers are round 2, CLG versus FlyQuest, the two teams that lost in round 1. And I'm going to give this one to FlyQuest. I love CLG to death, but they're reaching over their heads going up against FlyQuest. The talent disparity between these two teams is just too big for me to go in a direction that isn't FlyQuest absolutely dominating this series. And I think that's how it is. I really do think the top 3 teams are kind of in a league of their own. Evil Geniuses and CLG kind of bridging the gap. Golden Guardians kind of at the bottom of that, in my opinion, in terms of the playoff rankings. But I would predict FlyQuest 3-0, FlyQuest 3-1. Hopefully I'm wrong. I love the CLG team. They're super fun to watch, but FlyQuest seems like the kind of team that would be able to take care of some young upstarts that maybe just aren't as mechanically talented as their opponents on the other side. But then we get the most important matchup of the entire tournament, the matchup for the finals appearance. Cloud9 winning that series against 100 Thieves book their ticket to MSI. The winner of this series between 100 Thieves and FlyQuest will also book their ticket. Remember, 2 teams from the LCS being the 2 finals teams. And so whoever wins this is going to MSI with Cloud9. And I have FlyQuest. Some people are going to hate this. Some people are like, why did you choose 100 Thieves in the first part of the bracket? I think if you get FlyQuest beating Evil Geniuses, beating CLG, I think if you get that confidence under their belt, I do think they'll be able to take down 100 Thieves. They are the better team. On paper, they should be able to beat them, and I think at their best, they've been able to prove that they are that team. They've done a really good job taking care of this 100 Thieves team in the past. I do think they have their number a bit. Prince to Doublelift especially. Prince has been awesome in those games against Doublelift, and I think that would continue here, but you know, I got FlyQuest going to MSI. That means my finals, my projected finals in the spring split here. C9 FlyQuest, it's the series we all want to see in the finals. I know I speak for myself. These are the 2 teams that I really want to see go head-to-head. And in the finals, I have Cloud9. I tried to build up some suspense. Maybe I'm going to, like, shock you with FlyQuest. No, I'm going Cloud9. They should be the better team here. Final series between 2 good teams always turn into one of 2 things. Either an utter stomp or a really close best of 5. And I don't know which one this would be. I could absolutely see this be an utter stomp where Cloud9's just like Berserker goes off and gets finals MVP, or Blabber's just dominating the jungle matchup. I could absolutely see that. But I'm going to predict Cloud9 in 5. Cloud9 3-2. And then my spread's going to be Cloud9 3-1. I know some people might want me to say FlyQuest 3-1, but I really do think Cloud9 should have this one in the bag. They should be the best team in the LCS, and they should be representing North America as the #1 seed at MSI, just like they did at Worlds last year. But that's my full bracket prediction. Let me know down in the comment section below what you guys think of all that. Let me know what teams I'm undervaluing, what teams am I overvaluing. Of course, just like the All-Pro stuff, all of our opinions are probably going to be a little bit different. It's okay that we have different opinions. I'm not a moron for not thinking the way you think. You're not a moron for not thinking the way I think. We all watch the same games, and we all come away with different things, and that's fun. So, you know, discussions down in the comments are always great as long as they are kind of centered in a positive way, but you know, I would really appreciate it if you guys liked the video. Again, we put a lot of time and effort into these. There was a lot of work that goes into making these primer videos, and I really do hope you guys enjoy them. Of course, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button. Not only do we do LCS coverage, we do LCK, LPL, LEC, NACL, and with playoffs coming up for basically all of them, you're not going to want to miss a lot of the videos that we are putting out on this channel. I would really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. I know I'm a little bit annoying about that at the end of videos, but you know, statistically speaking, it shows that it works. And so, you know, if you made it this far, you're probably willing to put up with a little bit of shilling at the end for myself. But With all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.